Have you ever looked at someone and thought that if you were just as strong, if you were just as smart, if you were just as talented as they were, you could be just as successful? I'm talking about the idea that our own faults and failures aren't because we lack the effort, but because we're just not naturally talented enough. I bet all of us have felt that feeling at least a couple of times in our lives. And there's obviously circumstantial things that are just out of our control, but those who can stand up to that adversity and push through regardless set a beautiful example for everyone else. Hard work can beat talent. Not that it always does, but it can. There's a certain level of pride that the mediocre can achieve, something that those with natural talent will never truly experience. That feeling of knowing that you're fighting a losing battle and still refusing to give in is what makes the average so strong. And when it comes to having pride in that mediocrity, nobody does it better than Zanka. Gachi has been getting hella popular recently, but it still hasn't been around for super long, so I wouldn't blame you if you're unfamiliar with Zanka's game. His character is a testament to all those who feel like they've never truly been gifted, which is something that honestly lets me resonate super easily with this character. I've always felt that the things that I'm good at have been due to my own hard work because I often lack talent, and maybe that's just a self-serving bias, who knows. But regardless, Zanka feels like less of an anime archetype and more of a human one. Before I start micro-analyzing his mindset and motivations though, I should probably do a quick background on who the guy really is. Zanka is part of a group that uses their weapons to fight these massive monsters known as trash beasts, although Gachi kinda tends to ignore that aspect in favor of human-on-human conflict more, but that's a whole other can of worms. Anyways though, like I was saying, Zanka is a cleaner. Before all that though, Zanka was from a completely different faction, one that would actually seem to go against everything that he now stands for, the Hellguard. Stemming from the royal Nijuku clan, Zanka had been perceived as a prodigy ever since childhood. He was still training incredibly hard behind the scenes, but to himself and everyone else, he was a genius. He longed for the golden chair, a seat reserved only for the best student in the Hellguard every year, and it was his duty to take that seat. Then all of a sudden, a new member joined the class, a smaller woman by the name of Hyo, and on her first sparring session, she beat the entire class to a pulp, with Zanka receiving the worst of it. It wasn't as big of a deal to the other students, as they already understood that they weren't natural talents, but it was different to Zanka. In their battle, not only did Hyo completely outclass him, but she destroyed his spirit as well. She wasn't even a noble like him. She was just some kid from the slums, and yet she was such a natural talent. His entire worldview had been shattered in a matter of minutes. He had always thought that he was a genius, that he was capable of sitting in that golden chair. But in a single moment, that entire idea was crushed. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't even close. He was average, just like the rest of his class. Yet even with the broken spirit, he still clung on to that thin strand of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could still earn that title of genius. When it was time to select new weapons, he had an idea. Everyone else would try and take the strongest looking tool, but he figured that a real genius would try and think outside the box. A simple stick, he thought. It wouldn't have been put there for no reason. It had to be some sort of secret powerful tool. Turns out though, it wasn't. It was a simple stick after all, and the so-called real genius Hyo simply selected a sturdy looking sword. In a desperate attempt to regain his genius status, he failed again and fell into a deep well of despair. Like literally, he crawled into a well and didn't move for 3 days after that incident. However, after some time, a random man seemingly stumbled upon him, and while Zanka was wallowing in his self-pity about how an average bum can never stack up to the real geniuses of the world, the man gave him some advice. Not that I know what makes someone a natural talent, but if that's not what you say you are, who says you need to be? You can't be strong unless you know your weaknesses. I'd like to see you prove one day that the average can eclipse the gifted. Those few words had once again reshaped the way Zanka thought about the world. Yeah, he was average, but what's stopping him from being great too? He doesn't need to be some genius born with talent. Matter of fact, he doesn't even want to be. He was going to show everyone to never underestimate mediocrity. Now with all that said, there is one major part of Zanka's character that I think many people get wrong. Every time we see Zanka talking to someone else, he's always saying to never underestimate mediocrity and how the average man can be just as strong as a genius. But deep down, while this black and white division of average and gifted might be his greatest strength, it's also his greatest weakness. This guy clearly suffers from a major inferiority complex, and when he's not among others, we witness the true emotions going on in his head. While he trains incredibly hard and is very powerful to boot, he still thinks that he's just average. His self-proclaimed mediocrity makes him think that he's lesser than someone like the likes of Engine, Jabber, and Rudo. And that drive to keep pushing further beyond and achieve great heights as an average guy is what keeps him going. But by staying within that mindset, he's always going to be limiting himself by not acknowledging how strong he's actually become. And if I could just spitball for a second, we've also seen that vital instruments can have multiple release forms too. So maybe if he would actually acknowledge his skills instead of always classifying himself as some kind of lesser being, it's possible he could even have a stronger release form. Speaking of his Jinki though, compared to many of his fellow cleaners, Zanka's vital instrument is kind of mid, which is another major reason for his inferiority complex. It's not that it's bad, but when looking at someone like Ryo with massive metal scissors with insane cutting power, or Engine who has an umbrella made for incredible offense and defense, Zanka's stick definitely seems like the weakest of the bunch. Something I recently noticed though was the name of his stick and how it actually reflects his character. Lovely Assist Staff is the name of his Jinki, and while it definitely sounds a little goofy, instead of trying to create power through his vital instrument, he uses his staff to actually increase his own strength. That might sound like I'm reading way too into things, but just take a look at his fights. He's not just using the staff for every attack, but rather it's a tool that he can also use for movement and positioning, everything, and he's not afraid to use punches and kicks in conjunction with his regular attacks too. Then if we look at say Enjin's first fight from the start of the series, we can see that every attack that he throws or blocks is only possible because of his Jinki. Zanka however doesn't rely solely on his staff, he lets it assist in his natural fighting style, opting for a smarter approach to battle than his fellow cleaners. When you're like Zanka and have such a lackluster tool compared to these other natural talents, the only way he'd ever actually be able to keep up is through an insane amount of training and intelligence. I bet many of the other cleaners have good training regimens too, but we know that Zanka trains hard every single day and cares deeply for his staff. And even when he was thought to be a big shot natural, he was still working incredibly hard. Also, bro's strength is actually insane, like he is literally table flipping the ground. And if we're talking grit, Zanka literally stood 10 toes down against Jabber when he turned into a literal tornado. When bro got knocked down and was presumably out, he even stopped Jabber's claws with his teeth, double pumped him in the ribs, and did 4 front flips on him. Zanka's not only incredibly smart, but when he's out of creative options, he's always willing to charge straight ahead. He even knows his Jinki so incredibly well that he can stab it into the ground and sense the vibrations of everything around him, simply because he spent so much time learning how his stick is built and the way it interacts with the environment. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't think that someone like Enjin or Rio knows their tool well enough to do something like that. And if I could toss just a little more glaze in there for good measure, Zanka's wits and ability to keep a cool head is something that I really think sets him apart from the rest of the cleaners. While everyone else can kind of just rely on insane strength, Zanka has literally said himself that the average folks like him need to think a bit outside the box, which is why he's lauded as such a good teacher, and one of the best when it comes to handling his vital instrument. Not that he's stronger, because trust me, power scaling wise, respectfully my boy gets outclassed, but in terms of actual technique with his Jinki, he's kind of the GOAT. Similarly, when all the cleaners finally met up with Amo in the desert, everyone seemed to put away their vital instrument, except for Zanka, which I don't think was just random chance. I believe that he was actually the only one who still had his mind scouting out for possible danger and chose to keep his Jinki out just in case. A very small detail, but one that really solidified his character. He doesn't have any special moves or ultimate abilities like the rest. His strength literally only comes from incredible mastery over his tool and fighting style, although he does have some pretty cool jet propelled spikes that can pierce enemies if he locks them down. Zanka also possesses another quality that isn't often talked about, and that's his role as a side character. Except for a few animes that subvert the norms, the majority of protagonists will always start out at a certain power level, face some sort of enemy, and then usually get stronger during their fight to beat them. However, as a side character, there's a lot less of an expectation for Zanka to always come out victorious compared to someone like Ruto where it's expected. This way, we never really know going into a fight whether Zanka's actually gonna win or not, and it really makes his character feel like he's not protected by the plot or any kind of genius level powers. The author literally makes his character feel like he has to work harder than anyone else just to keep up, and that's what I love about him. When Zanka actually wins, it doesn't just feel like he was supposed to, it's like he actually earned that victory. And before y'all go typing away in the comments, yes, I am clearly a Zanka defender, and I think it honestly makes a lot of sense that he lost to Jabber twice. Unless we didn't watch the same damn fights, it literally seemed like Zanka would pull off some insanely diabolical move that would have taken out any other fighter. But because this absolute freak loves pain and can dull his senses to fight even longer, Zanka just got matched up terribly. Not only that, but Zanka could literally land 100 hits on Jabber and he would walk it off, while Jabber only has to land 1 hit and the neurotoxin will do the rest of the work. It's the Jogo and Renji treatment. Both characters are insanely strong, but unfortunately it's just a really bad matchup. Gachiakuta is also only about halfway done, so from what I've heard, there's still a lot more backstories that haven't been explained yet, but even out of the relative few that we do know so far, I still think that Zanka's resonates the hardest. His motivations are more than just wanting to become the strongest. Rather, it's his unstoppable urge to prove to others that the mediocre can be just as strong as the genius. And even though he may think he's already proven that to himself, he most certainly hasn't, which is why his drive to progress is so strong. A character's strengths might be what they're known for, but their flaws are what cement them as a well-written character, and I think that Zanka is a perfect example of that concept. Especially when looking at his relationship with his siblings that stayed in the Hellguard, Zanka is actually really scared of them, as he sees them as geniuses opposed to his mediocre self. They expected him to be something so much more than he was, a level of strength that he never naturally possessed, and their expectations for him not only drove Zanka to become as strong as he is now, but it's also his biggest limiting factor, as once again he sees himself as inherently lesser or weaker than his brother and sister. Gachiakuta's mangaka Kiurana also created a one-shot prior to the manga's debut called Shikido. It's a story about becoming the strongest swordsman, which was honestly quite a fun little read, but I can definitely also see some significant inspiration for Zanka's character in this one-shot. The main character Homura is a lot like Zanka, an average guy who wants to prove himself as stronger than people think. They both share the desire to be recognized by their peers by becoming stronger than anyone thought possible, but Homura is definitely a lot more of an airhead and far less tactical than Zanka. This time, however, instead of Hyo, the protagonist Gin is the genius who absolutely demolishes Homura every time they spar. There doesn't seem to be much of a deeper connection when it comes to Zanka's inferiority complex though, but it's definitely cool to see some inspiration in her previous works. As you can tell, I really love Zanka's character because I feel like he encapsulates the characters who don't often get much of a spotlight, the ones who aren't as great as the protagonists and rarely get their time to shine, which if you've seen the most recent chapters of the manga might end up being a bit contradictory to what I said, but regardless, I still love his character. There's just something about Zanka that not only makes him incredibly interesting, but honestly such an inspiring character. In a world without fancy powers and superhuman abilities like the one that we live in, feeling average or less than is even more prevalent, so having a character that's the pinnacle of mediocrity taken to the max level is something that I think a lot of us can really look up to. Most of us aren't naturally gifted, and that's okay, because the drive to succeed is strongest when you actually have something truly difficult to accomplish. His good quality is his inexhaustible flame. It consumes his inept and naive past, and when his heart struggles to break free, it leads him to evolve.